From Social Prosperity Partners, this is Community Catalysts. Welcome to Community Catalysts, the podcast that examines the qualities of community leadership and the many paths and forms it can take. I'm your host, Matt Lehrman. Today, our guest is Nichole Weiler, LCSW, that's Licensed Clinical Social Worker. She's based in Norfolk, Virginia, and specializes in trauma, depression, and anxiety, providing essential support to individuals, families, and couples, as well as military personnel and first responders. We are recording this interview just 8 days before Nichole joins me at the Virginia Mayor's Institute, hosted by the Virginia Municipal League, where she will serve as a professional resource for a courageous conversation I've been invited to facilitate. During the session, mayors will talk candidly about the stresses of civic leadership, and I am really looking forward to the insights and perspectives Nichole is going to bring to that discussion. But to help maintain the privacy and protect the trust of those who will be participating, she and I have opted to record this conversation ahead of time. Nichole, thanks for joining me and welcome to Community Catalysts.
Thank you for having me, Matt. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm really looking forward to our time with the mayors next week. So, Nichole, I want to begin by addressing what I think is a devastating statistic that you probably know really well, but I first learned about during my podcast interview last February with Police Chief Rudy Mendoza of Tolleson, Arizona. He had shared with me that for someone who joins the police force, say in their 20s and retires after about 20 years of service, so in their 40s, that the average life expectancy after retirement is just 6 years. Now, I know you listened to that interview, and Chief Mendoza explained that this alarming reality is why he sought therapy himself, and why he encourages his officers to do the same, and why he speaks publicly about the need for therapy and the benefit of it, because he believes it's essential to break the stigma around seeking mental health support. So can you just help us understand what is it about the role of a first responder that takes such a profound toll?
So I think there's a couple things. I don't think a lot of people recognize the ups and downs, stress levels that are tasked on a first responder's body every single day. They may go from helping someone change their tire to a domestic violence situation, back to someone changing their tire, back to a shooting. So their body rhythms are constantly up and down. And as humans, that's not how our bodies are made. So I think one of the issues is the stress level that is put on their bodies. There is actually, I'm not sure if it's, nationwide, but there is a law here in Virginia called the Heart and Lung Bill, and it's specifically for first responders because so many of them have heart issues because of the task that all this stress is put on. The lung bill is more probably for the firemen who have to experience all of the chemicals and things like that. The other issue, I think, for the stress level after they retire, and I talk a lot about this, especially with those that are getting ready to retire, and including the academy at the beginning, that when you retire from this kind of a, what do I call it? So intense, always on job, that when you retire and you go home and you're not getting the calls anymore, you're hearing the sirens, but you don't know what's happening. It gets really quiet. And in that quiet, if you haven't done work throughout your career on some of the traumatic events that you've gone to, those get stuck in your head. And unfortunately, there's a really high suicide rate as well among first responders, especially those after retirement, because there's so much going on in their head and they've never dealt with it. And then unfortunately, a lot of my retirees, they've made the comments that, when they turn in their badge and guns, there's no pomp and circumstance. Can't remember what that's called. And they just hand in their badge and guns after a 25-year career and they go on. And then they don't, the friends that they thought they had made are still on the job, so they don't hear from them. So I think
Nichole,
there's a lot that goes along.
let's break this apart a little bit. The first part you talked about was this, I guess it's a rush of adrenaline, that when you're on the job, you go from helping someone nice and calmly to all of a sudden, facing a life or death situation or chasing someone who's speeding or whatever. And you're just saying, is it the cycle of going, of the sudden rush of adrenaline constantly throughout the day? That on its own takes a toll?
Absolutely. I mean, just for, as a civilian, think about, say you almost got to a car crash, right? Someone cut you off and you almost hit them. Think about the adrenaline that's going on in your body just from that. And then you don't have anything after that. So your body has a chance to calm down. Now think about that happening 10 times over a 10-hour shift or 8-hour shift. And in between those adrenaline rushes, then you have this really calm, and then you go right back up. A lot of the guys have these adrenaline dumps too after these big events because their body is just needing to release all of that energy that they have created within them from the emotions. If you think about car accidents, after a car accident, a lot of people don't know they're hurt because they're in a state of shock, because our bodies know how to shut down and do what they need to do. These guys are so well trained, their body will shut down and do what they need to do. And then the body recovers or doesn't recover. So then they have all this stuff stuck. And that's where it affects the physical for them.
Then you talked about what happens at retirement. So after 20 years, and I imagine it happens a lot sooner than 20 years. You don't have to wait 20 years for this to happen. But after 20 years, if you've been, if you become accustomed to this, that all of a sudden you've retired, now all of a sudden there's a calm. Tell me more about that. What's the sensation of being cut off from those adrenaline rushes?
It's actually really huge. Even some of the guys who go from patrol and like to be the runners and gunners, and then they get into more of a supervisor job where they're not on the street anymore. They're not getting those adrenaline, because a lot of guys really like the excitement. That's why they do this job, because they like that. They like the adrenaline. That's just part of their system. And then when they get, either into these positions where there's not that, or into retirement, there's almost a need, there's a desire. And if they can't find a way to fulfill it, then it's almost like an identity. It's almost like a piece of their personality that's not being fulfilled, which can cause some depression and things like that, because they don't feel like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
They don't feel fulfilled.
Exactly.
So maybe we could talk about maybe this other dimension of it. I was trying to think about how we talk about these kinds of issues for people who are civic leaders, mayors, council members, school board members, city managers, and other people who are hired into these positions. And I wonder what we can glean from your experience. Sometimes first responders face intense, high-stake pressure. And then sometimes they're responding to long-standing community conflicts. There's kind of this built-in pressure that exists over time. How do you think about the difference between dealing with the crisis of the moment and dealing with the worry that kind of exists over time, that maybe never goes away?
Well, I think, especially in the way society is now, especially after, the George Floyd, that I think first responders have that, just like city leaders have that worry of what's going to happen next, right? How am I going to handle it if there's more, outburst or another situation happens? I think first responders and, civic leaders and managers and things like that also have the public eye on them. So there's always that conflict too of, how are they perceiving me? What do I need to do? I feel like I'm doing the right thing, but these people are telling me I'm not. So I think there's a really good connection between, the first responder world and the city leaders, the mayors, and all of those, because they are the eyes and ears of our communities, and they're the protectors of our communities. The first responders are the boots on the ground with the protection and taking care of, where the city managers and things like that, they have to make the right decisions for the community so that everything is taken care of and unrest and things like that can maybe be avoided.
What's the technique you use to get someone to stop worrying about the what ifs?
So I do something very simple. It's just called mindfulness. I just have them sit and look around my room. I have them tell me what they see, tell me what they hear, tell me what they smell. What's it feel like to be sitting on my couch? Can you feel air on you? You have a taste in your mouth. Some of the guys, I will actually give them hot fireballs, like hard candies or the hot cinnamon disc or Altoids. And I'll have them pop one of them in their mouth because if you've ever had one, as soon as you pop one of those in your mouth, it just lights you up and you can't avoid it. You taste it, you smell it, you feel it. You can almost hear it sizzle, right? And it just really brings them back into their body. So I've suggested for a lot of them in between calls, have those in your car. And if you feel like you need to reground yourself, because that's all mindfulness is grounding ourselves. The what if is all about the brain and, the future and all of that. But if you're sitting here grounded, then you're taking care of what needs to be taken care of. And those what ifs don't cause that anxiety that they can sometimes cause.
I'm going to ask you to do something really hard. I want you to imagine yourself as the mayor or council member or school board member, and you know that there's a contentious meeting that you're about to be up on the dais for. If you do this mindfulness exercise before you go into the building or before you take your seat up in front of everyone, the point is to calm yourself down, right?
It's just to ground yourself, to bring yourself into the present moment.
All right. And so walk me through then. You've grounded yourself, and then what? How do you get from that grounded position to present in the issue, whatever that's going on there?
Well, if you're grounded, you're already in that present moment. And I think in that present moment, that contention that's coming at you from whatever the argument is, whatever the meeting is, it's easier to consume instead of if you're already coming in anxious and a little maybe on the defensive, that's going to come at you differently. But if you can be in that grounded, present, authentic space within yourself, you might be able to hear things differently. It might not feel as contentious. You might be able to hear something and be like, oh, yeah, you're right. Where if you're more in that defensive mode, you're just going to come back at them and you're not really going to hear anything. So that authentic space really allows you to be aware of what's actually coming, aware of the tones, aware of the words, so that you really can be there with these people who may be very angry, and maybe you came in thinking they were angry for something wrong, but in that authentic space, actually hearing what they're saying, you actually hear them and have a little bit of empathy, and then the conversation can change.
Are there any quick tips that you offer to a first responder about how they should carry themselves or behave so that they are seen in a certain way?
Police officers, I think the reason I get along so well with them is I just tell them to be them. They joined the police force. They joined, the sheriff's department or state troopers or, firemen. They joined for a reason, right? And don't ever forget that reason, because when you forget that reason, then you're not doing the job for the right reason. And it just all goes back to the authenticity. If you're being you, and you're going to have a good conversation and maybe able to talk someone who's having a mental health crisis down, where if you come in from an ego of I'm a big bad police officer, that situation's going to go the wrong way.
I have a similar conversation with council members because I work with groups of people, and I work with groups of people who it's built into the system that they're supposed to disagree with each other and disagree with each other publicly because they're supposed to deliberate about how they see the world differently. And so the key part of this is that there's no good or bad or right or wrong in this. It is reasonable people coming together, being willing to listen to other reasonable people and coming to a reasonable solution together. But the body language matters. Leaning in and leaning forward to show that you're interested as opposed to sitting back with your arms crossed. It actually matters in human communication.
Have you ever seen the movie Dave?
Yes.
that is for me the best example of how I would love my city council, politicians, really anybody to work, because he brought everybody together in a way that made people not want to argue, right? It was just his approach. It was his, okay, let's bring in just a normal accountant and go through these books and really see what this is looking like, instead of saying, well, we're spending over here, but we want to spend over here, when we need to spend in the middle and we need to bring some cash in. So I've always loved that movie and thought, how simple would life be if that could be the way it was?
If only life was like the movies.
Right?
Let's switch gears a little bit. Nichole, when first responders experience traumatic events, they often require immediate intervention. And I'm interested what lessons from working with them might apply to civic leaders who are in the midst of particularly stressful situations. I'm thinking of a community emergency like has been going on in North Carolina and Virginia recently, or, facing, really intense political pressure.
Yeah. So what we do after a traumatic event, like if we do critical incident debriefings after some of the major events, like a officer involved shooting or mass violence or something like that. And I find it very helpful to the participants. A lot of them don't feel like they need to come, but once they come, I've never had one that they've left without saying, wow, that was really helpful. And it's basically just the resource. It's the resource of coming together and saying, this was my experience, having everyone talk about their experience, because then what happens, and a lot of times during these debriefs, is one person had an experience, but their experience, they had missing holes in their understanding. And then another person said, well, this is what happened. So then they were able to kind of close up that hole. So then they were able to see the whole event.
You mean one person dragged the person out of the burning building, the next person, handed it off to the next person who actually got them stabilized, and the next person got them into the ambulance and took them, wherever.
Right.
And so to be able to connect all those things and say that awful thing that you saw actually there was a conclusion to that story.
Absolutely, because the first person is going to say, I didn't do enough. The baby death. And then when they hear that third person who got them to the hospital and the person is now stabilized, now they have an understanding of, oh, I did my job, instead of questioning. What first responders see, humans shouldn't have to see at their level. That's just not what we're made for. The domestic violence that they've had to go to the same house over and over again, and finally it ends badly. And they kind of have a relationship with that family because they've seen them so often. That really takes a toll, in having these resources where we can come in and kind of help them process that. So, with city leaders and even upper, command of police departments and fire departments, I think there's a sense that they don't need it, right? They're the leaders, so they don't need the resources. They don't need to have the debriefs, where I feel like that's wrong. They may have been boots on the ground, but they had the vicarious trauma of having to make sure everything was taken care of. They may have been the ones that have been on the news talking about it and having all the reporters yelling at them, wanting questions and answers, and they can't give them to them. So I think for city leaders, I think it's really important to them to understand they need as much of those resources during these traumatic events as anyone else.
The challenge, of course, is that in a political environment, in a city council, you can't, after a contentious meeting, reconvene the city council privately to do a debrief. There's open meeting laws. There's just the political reality of these people may not want to open up personally to each other. So what advice do you give then to that individual who's been through what for them has been a traumatic experience and they need to debrief somehow? Is that one-on-one with a counselor, or, is it just okay to go home and just kind of talk it over with a spouse?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm always up for, obviously I'm a counselor, so I'm going to always, lean to go see a counselor and help them process that through. With the spouses, I think some people in leadership positions are very cautious about talking to their spouses. I know a lot of my first responders are cautious about talking to their spouses. because they don't want their spouses to worry about them because of the stress levels of the job. Maybe there's things that they can't talk to their spouses about because of confidentiality reasons. So I think it's finding that person, finding that counselor, finding that confidant, maybe finding even somebody, I don't know if this is allowed, but even finding someone who is on the board that you can kind of go back and forth with. Okay, let's talk this through. They don't allow them to process these things like they should. If you have an argument with your spouse, you get to go back and have that conversation to hopefully have a resolution. If they have laws preventing that, then I understand why people wonder why nothing's happening, because if they can't have a resolution, then what are we doing? We're just going to keep going back and forth and butting heads.
You raise a really interesting point that it's not just the toll on the individual that we're talking about. There is also a toll on their relationships. What is the advice you give them about how to engage with their loved one so that it doesn't ruin the relationship?
So I actually speak with a couple of the academies for police academies, and we have a family night just to kind of talk about what this job is going to look like. And one of the things that I tell them is have a conversation with, what do you want to know? What don't you want to know? At what level do you want to know? If the police officer, the councilman, whoever had a bad day and they just need time, have a code word. What if I say orange, I need to sit in the car for 20 minutes and I just need to be left alone. So when, they get elected, have that conversation with the family of, there's going to be days I'm going to come home and I have dealt with people all day. And the last thing I want to do is deal with people, even though they're my loved ones. So have that conversation. So when those days happen, there's already an understanding. Please don't take this personal. I just don't have the bandwidth to help you with your homework tonight.
In your work with first responders, you've probably identified early signs that someone is struggling with burnout or trauma. What are some of the red flags that civic leaders and their colleagues and the people who love them as well, what should they watch out for to ensure that they're recognizing and addressing stress before it becomes too overwhelming?
Behavior changes are the biggest sign, typically. If someone is usually very docile, they're very quiet, they're happy, and then all of a sudden they go quiet, or they start getting really angry easy, or, they're very angry and then all of a sudden they're nice, or they're trying to reach out. Pay attention to those little nuances of changes in behaviors, because that really speaks to something's going on.
Is there kind of a false equivalency at play here, where there are people who think that in order to serve the public good, that they're supposed to incur pain and anguish and have long-term repercussions from that? Is it possible that people affix to that, thinking that somehow that's the proper price to pay to do the work that they want to do?
I would play devil's advocate with you and say I think it's the opposite. I think they're of the mindset that won't happen to me. It's like the kid in high school where you're telling them time and time again, don't do that, don't do that. Oh, that won't happen to me, and then it happens to them. I don't think they think that far. I don't think they think in terms of that, because again, it's more about my job. What am I going to do to be successful at my job? And that's the goal. It's not what is this job going to do to my body, right? It's just like back to your analogy with the football players. They sign the contract that they're going to be a football player and they might be tackled a few times, but do they really talk about the concussions? Do they really talk about, was it Hamlin that got hit in the chest? That wasn't ever probably something that was ever considered, right? So I think it's just it's the job that they love to do. It's their passion. So they go into it. And it's more of that goal of, I'm going to be successful in this realm, and I'm not really going to pay attention to anything that's going to pull me back out of it.
Really interesting point. You're suggesting that people run for office not contemplating the toll that it might take on them. So if we were going to address that some way, does that suggest that there should be some sort of psychological training, some sort of orientation at least, that we should be giving to civic leaders to help them prepare for what's going to come once they've sworn the oath of office?
Why not? I mean, I think that needs to be addressed. I mean, when I was going through my social work school, that was talked about. We're going to get a lot of people bringing their stuff to us. How is that going to affect us, right? And how do we take care of that? How do we block ourselves from taking on their stories? I think for any profession that needs to be discussed. So, how do you prepare for that?
Nichole, I have one last big question I want to ask you, which is civic leaders around the country are often targets of incivility. And sometimes it's anger and obstinance and distrust or political division that takes place in council chambers. Sometimes there's personal encounters, like being confronted at the grocery store by, an angry neighbor, and I have heard this of civic leaders receiving death threats. And so I just want to ask you very bluntly, what advice can you offer to leaders who are in the heat of those kinds of moments? In any of those situations, if you could freeze time and whisper in the ear of the person who is incurring either of those, at any range of that spectrum, what would you suggest that they do to manage the situation, manage themselves, and kind of protect their own well-being?
Well, I think, again, back in preparation for our talk, you mentioned, sometimes there's name calling, right? I'm going to people call us names. And just like when I used to work with teenagers and kids and they would come to me about being bullied, my first question would be, well, is what they're saying about you true? And if it's not, then just brush it off, because that's probably a projection of how they feel about themselves.
Let me be clear. I spoke at a school board association recently, and I had a member of the audience, someone who sits on a school board, say that she was sitting up on the dais and a resident came up, a member of the community came up, and to her face in front of everyone called her, I forget the exact words, but essentially said, "You're an ugly fat slob."
So again, that's just bullying behavior, in my opinion. So she can absolutely take that personal, or she can recognize, I'm really not, this person is coming at me angry. And she can then say, I'm not going to take this personal because I don't feel I am that. But it sounds like you're really angry about something. Tell me more about that. So it's changing the conversation and actually recognizing the tone that's coming at them.
I think I would add this to the training that we were just talking about a moment ago, to also know where the line is that someone is not allowed to cross, right? When it turns into harassment, when it turns into a threat, that you're activating law enforcement, you're also activating your legal counsel, maybe the city or the town or the school board's legal counsel, or your own if necessary. And that if you are clear on how far someone can get to the line without crossing over, then you're better able to receive it, because you know that if they step over, there's going to be other kinds of consequences that come into play.
Absolutely. And have that understanding before you start the job, right? What are going to be my boundaries in this job? What am I going to allow to be said or done to me and or my family? And then hold yourself accountable that when that line is crossed, do what needs to be done to stop it. Because I wonder how many people in, the public realm allow a lot of this to happen. And then it just keeps going and it goes and it escalates because they feel like, well, I'm in the public sector. I'm not allowed to protect myself and my family. So it's having that understanding of I'm going to hold myself accountable to report things, but I'm also going to hold people accountable that they can't treat me like that.
I want you to imagine, Nichole, that I am a mayor or council member or whatever, and we've just met, and I've told you what you said earlier, that I think I'm impervious. I think I'm strong. I know who I am, and I'm about to swear the oath of office and take office for the first time. And I think I have a pretty good idea of, what I'm in for. What would you tell me? What's your best case to tell me that I need to take care of my mental health proactively?
I love playing devil's advocate, and I would come back at you and say, so what's going to happen when someone calls you fat and ugly? What are you going to do with that? And then have them understand how that might affect them. What's going to happen when someone calls your house and threatens your family? What are you going to do with that? And have them start seeing some of those things that can happen in this new position, so that they know what they're getting into. It's just like with the family academies that I do with the local police department here. I'm kind of a Debbie Downer because I explain to them this is a great profession, but this can also really affect the families and affect the officers. So let's just be honest. Let's have an honest conversation about the good pieces of this job. But let's just be real about the bad pieces of this job and how we're going to handle it when and if those things come up.
Nichole, we're going to have a really interesting conversation with the mayors at the Virginia Municipal League, aren't we?
I think so. I'm looking forward to it.
I am so grateful that you're going to be doing this with me and you're going to be a resource to the mayors there. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. It's been wonderful talking to you. I will see you in 8 days. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
My deepest thanks to Nichole Weiler, LCSW, that's Licensed Clinical Social Worker based in Norfolk, Virginia, for sharing her insights with us today. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to the Virginia Municipal League and its CEO, Michelle Gowdy, for allowing and inviting this vital conversation among their members. This episode was edited by Nick Living the Dream Tantillo. Our executive producer is John Little. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. Ask me a question, share a comment, or let me know that you have a story to share. You can reach me at 602-688-2724 or Matt, M-A-T-T, at socialprosperity.us. I'd love to hear from you. We'll be back soon with another Community Catalyst.